My stepmother handed me a trash bag containing my clothes, while my white brother-in-law held out a crisp $100 bill. He told me to take an Uber to the suburbs and not to make an angry black woman scene. They thought they were evicting a college dropout from a borrowed apartment so they could host their elite investors. I just smiled, took out my phone, and made a single call. Soon armed security was dragging them out of the lobby. Because what my family did not know was that I did not just live in Penthouse 106, I owned the entire 40-story building. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach your toxic family a lesson they will never forget. I pushed open the doors of Penthouse 106, dropping my bag. I had just returned from Chicago and walked into a construction zone. My stepmother Valerie was pointing a laser measuring tape at my windows. Beside her, my half-sister Jasmine tapped on her phone, while her husband Connor paced talking about investors. Valerie spun around looking triumphant. She gestured toward 3 black garbage bags sitting by the elevator bank. "I packed your things," she announced with fake sweetness. "Jasmine and Connor need this huge space to host Silicon Valley investors." I stood blinking away my travel fatigue, trying to process the audacity. "You packed my clothes into garbage bags?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Valerie rolled her eyes. "Maya, you dropped out of Clark Atlanta a decade ago. You do not need a luxury penthouse in Buckhead. Jasmine is building a real future. She needs this family's support more than you do." Connor stepped forward. He carried himself with the unearned confidence of an arrogant white man who married into a wealthy black family. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and held it out to me. "Look, Maya," he said. "Your dad let you crash here out of pity, but it is time for the adults to take over. Take this cash, get an Uber, and please do not make an angry black woman scene." Jasmine did not defend me. She just went back to scrolling on her phone. A decade ago, this would have broken me, but I had spent the last 10 years silently turning my late mother's trust fund into a massive commercial real estate empire. I looked in the eye. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed a number. "Yes, security." I said, my tone perfectly level. "This is Maya, the owner of the towers. I have 3 intruders trespassing in Penthouse 106. Please send an armed escort immediately." Valerie let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Have you lost your mind, Maya? Who do you think you are calling the owner of the towers?" She turned to Jasmine, shaking her head. "Your sister has finally cracked. We need to call a hospital, not an Uber." I did not bother responding. I just checked my watch. Exactly 90 seconds later, the private elevator chimed. The doors slid open, and 4 armed security guards stepped into the penthouse. The head of security, a towering man named David, immediately locked eyes with me and gave a respectful nod. "Miss Maya," he said, his voice booming across the room. "Is everything all right? We got your distress call." Valerie's mocking smile vanished instantly. She stared at David, then back at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Connor dropped his laser measurer. "Wait, what is going on here?" Connor demanded, stepping toward the guards. "I am Connor. I am moving into this unit. My father-in-law, Calvin, made the arrangements." David ignored him completely, keeping his focus entirely on me. "What are your orders, ma'am?" he asked. I pointed to the garbage bags by the door. "Please escort these trespassers off my property. And David, make sure they leave through the service elevator. I do not want them upsetting the actual paying residents in the main lobby." Connor turned beet red, stepping aggressively toward me. "What kind of scam are you pulling? You do not own this building. You are a broke college dropout. You." David stepped between us, resting his hand casually on his utility belt. "Sir," he warned, his voice dropping an octave. "You need to step back from the building owner right now, or you will leave this penthouse in handcuffs." Jasmine finally dropped her phone, her eyes wide with panic. "Mom, what is happening?" she shrieked, grabbing Valerie's arm. Valerie was trembling, her eyes darting frantically around the luxury apartment she had just tried to steal. "Maya," she stammered, her voice completely losing its arrogant edge. "What What does he mean building owner? This is Calvin's property. He told us we could have it. I smiled, picking up the $100 bill Connor had tried to hand me and tucking it neatly into his jacket pocket. Calvin lied to you, I said softly. He never owned this building, Valerie. He was just the guarantor on my first loan 8 years ago. I bought the towers outright last year. Now take your trash bags and get out of my house before I have you arrested for breaking and entering. The guards grabbed Connor by the arms when he tried to argue, shoving him toward the service exit. Jasmine wailed as she grabbed Valerie, pulling her mother out the door. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, leaving me alone in my quiet, beautiful home. I walked over to the windows, looking out over the Atlanta skyline, breathing in the silence. But the peace only lasted for exactly 2 minutes. My phone began to vibrate violently on the kitchen island. The caller ID flashed my father's name. Calvin. I answered, putting him on speakerphone. Before I could even say hello, his voice exploded through the speaker, shaking with pure rage. "You disrespectful little brat," he roared. "You dare call armed security on your own sister and her husband? Who do you think you are? I am freezing your late mother's trust fund right this second. You will not see another dime until you sign that penthouse over to Connor." I arrived at the Buckhead Country Club 10 minutes early. I walked through the grand lobby to the private dining terrace where Calvin and Valerie insisted on meeting. They sat at a corner table overlooking the 18th hole. My father Calvin looked sharp in his golf polo, but deep lines around his eyes betrayed his stress. Valerie sat beside him, sipping a mimosa, like she had not just been humiliated and escorted out of my building yesterday. As I approached, Calvin did not stand. He simply glared. Before I could pull out my chair, he slammed a thick legal document onto the crisp white tablecloth. The water glasses rattled from the impact. "Sit down, Maya!" He barked, his voice tight with fury. I sat smoothing the skirt of my dress, keeping my movements unbothered. I glanced at the heavy document. The bold lettering clearly read Property Transfer Agreement. "You are going to sign that deed over to Connor right now," Calvin demanded. "You are going to apologize to your sister and her husband for that pathetic stunt you pulled yesterday. Then you will walk away quietly." Valerie smirked, sipping her drink. "We are trying to save you from yourself, Maya. You have always been prone to ridiculous outbursts. Jasmine needs a stable environment to host her husband's investors, and you are being incredibly selfish." I did not reach for the document. I signaled the waiter, who brought me a pot of Earl Grey tea. I poured myself a cup, letting the steam rise. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice level. "I am certainly not giving away a luxury building because you want to play pretend with Connor's fake tech money." Calvin's face flushed a dangerous shade of red. He slammed his fist on the table, drawing alarmed glances. "You ungrateful brat!" he snarled, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "You spent 2 years in bed crying after dropping out of Clark Atlanta. You embarrassed this family. I had to tell my business partners you were taking a gap year to hide that you were too mentally fragile to handle basic coursework. I should have institutionalized you." Valerie nodded eagerly in agreement. "Your father has been too generous with you, Maya. He let you live in that penthouse out of pity." Calvin pointed a finger directly at my face. "You will sign that deed today, or I am cutting you off forever. I am the executor of your mother's trust fund. There is $2 million sitting in that account right now. If you do not sign this property over to Connor, I will completely freeze the trust. You will not see a single dime of your mother's money for the rest of your miserable life." I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the rich flavor before setting the delicate porcelain cup back onto its saucer. My expression remained entirely unchanged. Calvin had been using my mother's trust fund as a weapon against me for a decade. He thought it was the ultimate leash. He thought I was still the broken 22-year-old girl crying in her childhood bedroom. To my right, my lawyer Elias stepped out from the main dining room. He approached our table with quiet authority, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. Calvin and Valerie stared at him in utter confusion. "Who the hell is this?" Calvin demanded. "This is Elias, my chief legal counsel," I explained casually. Elias did not offer a greeting. He unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a massive, bound financial portfolio. He dropped it directly on top of Calvin's property transfer agreement, burying the pathetic demand under hard evidence. Calvin stared at the portfolio, his brow furrowing. "What is this garbage?" he asked. I folded my hands neatly on the table. "You see, Dad, you thought I spent those 2 years doing nothing but crying. But you severely underestimated me. I did not just survive my depression. I used the initial trust payout I received 8 years ago to buy up distressed commercial properties. I flipped them, reinvested the profits, and built a real estate portfolio spanning 3 states. Valerie scoffed, rolling her eyes. "That is a complete lie. You barely leave that apartment. You sit around painting all day." Elias spoke, his deep voice carrying immense weight. "It is not a lie, Mrs. Valerie. My client currently holds over $50 million in commercial real estate assets. The Towers is merely one small piece of her holding company. The portfolio before you details her complete ownership and financial sovereignty." Calvin stared at the thick binder, his confidence wavering. He reached out with trembling fingers and flipped open the cover. His eyes scanned the first page, taking in the certified bank seals and asset valuations. I watched the arrogant bluster drain from his face, replaced by a creeping sense of absolute dread. "Even if this is true," Calvin stammered, trying to regain his footing, "I still control the main trust. I will freeze your $2 million. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, shrinking the distance between us. My gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. "Dad, I legally dissolved that trust 5 full years ago." Calvin's breath hitched. What he choked out. "That is impossible." "It is entirely possible when you have competent lawyers," I replied softly. "But more importantly, we need to talk about what you have been doing with the phantom trust fund you thought you still controlled. I know why you are desperate for me to hand my building over to Connor. You need his fake tech startup to succeed because you are completely bankrupt." Valerie gasped. "Calvin, what is she talking about?" I kept my eyes fixed on my father. "I know about the $2 million you quietly borrowed from what you thought was my trust fund to keep your failing logistics company afloat last year." Calvin's face went completely white. "You moved funds under false pretenses," I continued, my voice dropping to a whisper. "You forged my signature on the authorization forms. You committed massive federal wire fraud, Dad, and my holding company just finalized the acquisition of your primary auditing firm this morning." I stood up from the table, looking down at the man who had spent 10 years calling me a failure. "The federal audit is happening tomorrow morning," I said. "Have a wonderful afternoon." I left Calvin and Valerie sitting in stunned silence on the country club terrace. The meeting had gone exactly as I anticipated. Calvin was cornered and his fake empire was crumbling. I walked to my waiting car, feeling completely vindicated. But before I could process the victory, my phone lit up with a notification. It was an alert from Instagram. Jasmine was broadcasting live to her 500,000 followers. I tapped the notification and Jasmine's face filled my screen. She was sitting in our father's mansion, looking intentionally disheveled. Her usually perfect hair was messy and her mascara was smudged to give the illusion that she had been crying for hours. The viewer count was skyrocketing past 50,000 in a matter of minutes. People loved a Buckhead Society scandal, and Jasmine was giving them a front-row seat. I turned up the volume as she let out a theatrical sob. "My sister has always been deeply disturbed," Jasmine cried directly to the camera, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "She could not handle college and dropped out because she was too fragile for the real world. My family gave her everything. We gave her a beautiful penthouse to live in so she could heal. And now she cannot handle my happiness. She is so bitter and jealous of my marriage that she is trying to ruin us. She is trying to steal my husband's business out of pure spite." The comments section became a blur of rapid-fire text. Her followers were immediately outraged on her behalf, calling me toxic, jealous, and ungrateful. They praised Jasmine for being so incredibly brave. She read the supportive comments and her performance grew even more dramatic. "Connor is working so hard to build his tech startup," she continued, her voice trembling. "He just wants to change the world, and my sister is using her dirty money to drown us in lawsuits. I am so scared for my family, guys. I do not know what she will do next." I watched without a single flicker of emotion. I did not type a comment to defend myself. Engaging with a narcissist publicly only gives them the fuel. Jasmine wanted a screaming match. She wanted me to fulfill the angry black woman stereotype Connor had tried to pin on me yesterday. She wanted me to look erratic, so her claims about my mental health would seem credible. I smiled, tapping the screen to minimize the video while keeping the audio playing. I dialed Elias. He answered on the first ring, having just left the country club himself. Elias, I said, keeping my voice measured. My sister is running a defamation campaign against me on a live broadcast. She is claiming I am mentally unstable and trying to steal her husband's fake company. Do you want me to draft a cease and desist letter? Elias asked. I can have it served to her at Calvin's house within the hour. No, I replied. A cease and desist is too quiet. Jasmine only cares about her image and sponsorships. Who holds the primary contract for her social media management? There was a brief pause. She is represented by Apex Influencer Group, he said. They manage all her major brand deals, including that lucrative cosmetics contract she relies on to fund her lifestyle. Who owns Apex? I asked. They are a subsidiary of a larger media conglomerate based right here in Atlanta, called Sterling Media Partners. Elias answered. Sterling Media Partners. I knew the CEO. We had played golf together last month, and he mentioned he was looking to liquidate a few minor subsidiaries to generate capital for a new acquisition. Elias. I want to buy Apex Influencer Group. Contact the CEO of Sterling Media Partners right now. Offer him 20% above market value for an expedited cash sale. I want full ownership of the agency transferred to my holding company by the end of the business day. Consider it done, Maya, Elias replied without missing a beat. The acquisition moved with the speed that only unlimited capital can buy. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the final transfer documents. I signed my name legally, becoming the owner of the agency that controlled every single cent Jasmine earned. I pulled my phone back out. Jasmine was still live on Instagram now, doing a makeup tutorial, while occasionally pausing to sniffle and remind her audience of her tragic family situation. Her viewer count was hovering around 100,000. I opened my email client and drafted a formal message on the official letterhead of my newly acquired agency. I addressed it directly to Jasmine and copied her main booking manager. The subject line read, Immediate contract termination. In the email, I cited a strict morals clause that was standard in her contracts. I stated that her public broadcasts spreading unsubstantiated claims and participating in targeted harassment constituted a direct violation of company policy. Therefore, her management representation and all associated brand deals were terminated effectively, immediately. I hit send. I leaned back in my chair and watched my screen. Jasmine was in the middle of applying lip gloss, talking about how Connor was such a strong man for dealing with my supposed abuse. Suddenly, her eyes darted away from the camera lens and down toward the top of her screen where a push notification had just appeared. She stopped talking mid-sentence. The lip gloss wand hovered frozen in the air. I watched as her eyes quickly scanned the preview text of the email. Her jaw dropped open. The fake sad expression vanished, replaced by genuine, unadulterated terror. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. This has to be a mistake. The comment section immediately noticed her reaction. Her followers started asking what was wrong. Her hands began to shake violently. She dropped the lip gloss and frantically tapped the notification, opening the full email while still broadcasting live to the world. She read the sender details. She saw the name of the holding company. She realized exactly who had sent the termination notice. The realization washed over her face like ice water. She looked directly into the camera, her eyes wide and panicked. She reached forward and the screen went completely black. I smiled, turning off my phone and then peacefully turning back to my work. The fallout from my sister pulling the plug on her live stream was instantaneous. Within hours, gossip blogs across Atlanta were dissecting her sudden panic and the email that ended her career. But my stepmother Valerie was nothing if not a master of damage control. Instead of retreating in shame, she accelerated her grandest social play of the year. The annual Heritage Charity Gala was the crown jewel of the city's elite Black society. It was an event Valerie used to cement our family's facade of flawless success and unshakable wealth. This year, the gala was being held at the Grand Ballroom of the Georgia Aquarium, and Valerie had single-handedly steered the committee to make the evening a showcase for Connor's new company, Next Gen Logistics. She wanted to prove to the entire city that our family was thriving, and she explicitly ordered the security teams to ban me from the premises. I knew exactly what she was doing. By elevating Connor, she was trying to secure local investments to replace the trust fund money I cut off. The evening of the gala arrived, and Valerie held court near the whale shark exhibit. She was dripping in borrowed diamonds, holding a flute of champagne and speaking to a circle of wealthy doctors. I paid a caterer to keep an open phone line in his pocket so I could hear every word. Valerie sighed dramatically, taking a sip of her drink before poisoning my name. "It is a tragedy, really," she told her friends, shaking her head with fake sorrow. "We had to cut Maya off completely. She is an absolute failure. You know she could never handle the pressure of real success. We tried to help her, but she became so erratic and unstable. Calvin and I finally realized we had to protect our peace. We are focusing all our energy on Jasmine and Connor's brilliant tech venture. Next Gen Logistics is going to revolutionize supply chains, and we simply cannot let Maya's jealousy hold us back anymore." The circle of socialites nodded in agreement, murmuring their support for Valerie's difficult maternal burden. They had no idea they were talking to a woman whose husband was days away from a federal indictment. I listened to her lies from the back of my Maybach idling just outside the valet entrance. I smoothed the skirt of my emerald green gown, checked my reflection, and stepped out into the humid Georgia night. The red carpet was lined with local photographers. I walked past them, ignoring the flashes, and approached the main entrance. Two large security guards immediately stepped in front of the glass doors, holding up their hands. Valerie had given them a printed photo of my face. "I am sorry, Mom," one of the guards said, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "We have strict orders from the gala chairwoman. You are not permitted inside this event." I did not argue or raise my voice. I stood there looking completely unbothered as Valerie spotted me from across the lobby. She marched toward the entrance with Calvin and Connor trailing closely behind. Her face was twisted into a victorious sneer. "I told you to stay away from us," Valerie hissed through the gap in the doors, her voice low enough to avoid drawing attention from the press. "You do not belong here. This event is for people who actually build things. Get back in your car before I have you arrested." Before I could reply, the heavy glass doors were pulled open from the inside by the event's executive director, a panicked woman named Sarah. She pushed past Valerie and the guards, looking breathless. She grabbed my hands with a desperate smile. "Maya, we are so incredibly honored to have you," Sarah announced, her voice carrying across the quiet lobby. "Please come in." The security guards looked at Valerie in confusion, then stepped aside. Valerie's jaw dropped. "Sarah, what are you doing?" she demanded, grabbing the director's arm. "I explicitly told you this woman is not on the guest list. She is a disruption." Sarah pulled her arm away, looking at Valerie like she was completely out of her mind. "Valerie," she said sharply, "Maya is not on the guest list because she is the platinum sponsor for the entire evening. Her holding company just covered the complete operational costs for the charity. She practically owns the event." Calvin's face drained of all color. Connor swallowed hard, pulling at his tight collar. Valerie stood frozen, her champagne flute trembling in her hand as the reality of her public humiliation washed over her. I did not say a word to them. I simply smiled at Sarah and allowed her to escort me past my silent family and straight into the grand ballroom. The timing was flawless. The master of ceremonies was just taking the stage to introduce the keynote presentation. He tapped the microphone, welcoming the crowd and announcing that the evening would highlight the future of Black excellence in technology, focusing on next-gen logistics. He asked Connor to come to the stage to present his vision. Connor puffed out his chest, trying to regain his false swagger. He walked up the steps, adjusting his suit, and stood behind the podium. He looked out at the sea of wealthy investors ready to pitch a company built on a foundation of absolute lies. But before he could speak a single word, I walked up the side stairs and gracefully stepped onto the stage. The ballroom fell into a hushed, confused silence. Connor looked at me with pure panic, his hands gripping the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stepped back instinctively as I approached the microphone. I looked out at the glittering crowd, spotting Calvin and Valerie standing near the back, their faces masks of sheer terror. The room was perfectly still, waiting for my next move. I leaned into the microphone, my voice projecting clearly and confidently across the massive space. I am thrilled to sponsor this event tonight and to support the future of innovation in our community. I am especially thrilled to be here to celebrate Connor's anticipated startup, NextGen Logistics. It is truly a remarkable piece of technology. In fact, it is so remarkable because NextGen Logistics is actually built on a stolen patent, a patent legally registered to my holding company, LLC. The gasp that rippled through the grand ballroom of the Georgia Aquarium was deafening. The wealthy elite of Atlanta, who had just been clapping for Connor, now stared at him in absolute horror. Connor stood frozen at the podium, his mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. He looked out at the sea of investors, and then down at me. He had absolutely no defense because he knew it was the truth. I had legally purchased the patent he was trying to build his entire fake logistics empire upon. I did not wait for his response. I handed the microphone back to the stunned master of ceremonies, gave a polite nod to the crowd, and walked back down the stage stairs. I strolled out of the ballroom, feeling the collective stares burning into my back. Valerie was leaning against a cocktail table, clutching her chest, while Calvin frantically dialed his phone, trying to reach his lawyers. The silence in that room was the sweetest music I had ever heard. I climbed into the back of my Maybach and told my driver to take me home. I thought the public humiliation would finally force them to retreat. I thought stripping them of their social standing and their fake wealth would be the end of their attacks. But narcissists do not retreat when they are cornered. They simply find a darker, lower level to sink to. Exactly 1 week after the charity gala, my concierge buzzed up to my penthouse to inform me that a process server was waiting in the lobby. I told security to let him up. The young man handed me a thick manila envelope and hurried back to the elevator. I sat at my kitchen island and sliced open the seal. I pulled out the legal documents, expecting another baseless lawsuit over the building ownership. Instead, the bold black letters across the top page made my blood run completely cold. It was a petition for a temporary emergency conservatorship. Calvin and Valerie had filed legal documents in the Fulton County Probate Court, claiming I was a danger to myself and others. They were petitioning a judge to strip me of my basic human rights. They wanted total legal and financial control over my $50 million empire. They wanted to freeze my bank accounts, lock me out of my businesses, and forcibly commit me for psychological evaluation. I read through the attached affidavits and felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest. Calvin had dug up my old medical records from a decade ago, when I was a struggling college dropout. He had attached letters from the therapist. I saw when my depression was at its worst. He weaponized the darkest, most vulnerable period of my life to convince a court that I was mentally unfit. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the very next morning. They had filed for an emergency injunction, hoping to catch me off guard, hoping I would not have time to mount a proper defense. They wanted to lock me away before I could finalize the federal audit of Calvin's logistics company. I immediately called Elias and told him to meet me at the courthouse. The courtroom was heavy with the smell of polished oak and old floorboards. I sat at the defense table wearing a tailored navy suit, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. Elias sat beside me, organizing a stack of folders. My father walked into the room wearing his most expensive custom suit. Valerie trailed behind him, holding a designer tissue ready to play the role of the heartbroken Mother Jasmine. And Connor did not show their faces. They were likely hiding from the press after the gala disaster. The presiding judge entered the room. She was a formidable African-American woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She took her seat at the bench, adjusting her glasses as she looked down at the petition. Calvin was the first to take the stand. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then he looked at the judge with an expression of profound manufactured grief. He spoke in a soft, trembling voice that he had clearly practiced in the mirror. "Your Honor, my daughter Maya is deeply unwell," Calvin testified, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "She has a documented history of severe mental instability. 10 years ago, she suffered a complete psychological collapse. She dropped out of college and isolated herself from reality. We have tried to love her through it, but her condition has deteriorated. She is erratic. She is experiencing grand delusions. She actually hallucinated owning these massive companies and crashed a charity event to spout paranoid conspiracy theories about my son-in-law. She needs medical intervention. She needs her family to take control of her assets for her own good, before she destroys her life completely." Valerie sobbed loudly from the gallery, dabbing her dry eyes. I sat completely still. I did not react. I did not glare at them. I did not shake my head. I knew that any display of anger would play right into their narrative. They wanted the judge to see an unstable, angry woman. The judge looked over her glasses at Calvin. Then she turned her gaze to the defense table. "Does the respondent have anything to say?" she asked. I remained silent. I simply looked at Elias and nodded. Elias stood up, his tall frame commanding absolute attention. He did not raise his voice, but his tone was razor-sharp. "Your Honor, my client chooses not to speak because the claims presented today do not warrant her breath," Elias said, walking toward the bench. "We are not submitting character witnesses. We are submitting absolute medical and financial fact." Elias handed a thick blue folder to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "Inside that folder you will find 3 independent psychological evaluations conducted over the past 48 hours, Elias explained. These evaluations were performed by the top board-certified psychiatrists in the state of Georgia. All 3 unanimously conclude that Maya is in pristine mental health. Furthermore, you will find certified bank records proving my client does indeed own $50 million in commercial real estate. It is not a hallucination. She is a self-made mogul." Calvin shifted uncomfortably in the witness stand, his confident posture beginning to slouch. "But that is not all. Your Honor," Elias continued, pulling a single sheet of paper from his pocket. "I would like to submit Exhibit B into the record. These are text messages sent directly from Calvin to my client late last night, less than 12 hours before he sat in this chair and claimed she was mentally incompetent." The judge took the paper and adjusted her glasses. Her eyes scanned the page, and her expression hardened into a look of absolute disgust. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy and suffocating. "Your Honor," Elias said, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls, "the petitioner sent 54 messages begging my client for a $3 million loan to save his bankrupt logistics company. He promised to drop this entire conservatorship petition if she wired the money to his offshore account. He is not trying to save his daughter. He is trying to steal her empire because he is drowning in his own debt." The judge lowered the paper. She looked at the text messages, then slowly turned her head to look at Calvin. My father was visibly shaking, sweat beading on his forehead. Valerie had stopped fake crying and was staring at her husband in horror. "Mr. Calvin," the judge said, her voice slicing through the room like a blade. "You come into my courtroom and attempt to use the probate system to hold your own daughter hostage for a payout. You weaponize mental health to cover up your financial ruin. This is the most despicable abuse of the legal process I have seen in my entire career." Calvin tried to speak. "Your Honor, I can explain. It is a misunderstanding." "You will be silent," the judge ordered, striking her gavel sharply. "Not only is this petition for conservatorship denied with extreme prejudice, but I am taking further action. I have reviewed the financial records your daughter submitted regarding your logistics firm. I am forwarding your forged financial documents and this entire transcript directly to the district attorney for immediate investigation of perjury and attempted extortion." Calvin's knees seemed to give out. He slumped back into the witness chair, his face buried in his hands. Valerie let out a genuine gasp of panic, dropping her designer purse onto the floor. "We are adjourned," the judge announced, striking her gavel one final time. I stood up from the defense table, smoothing my jacket. I looked at my father one last time. He was no longer the terrifying patriarch who ruled my childhood. He was just a small, desperate man facing a prison sentence. I turned my back on them and walked out of the courtroom, leaving them to face the absolute ruin they had built for themselves. I walked down the marble steps of the Fulton County Courthouse, leaving my father and stepmother to suffocate in the ruins of their own arrogance. The heavy, humid Atlanta air felt entirely different now. It felt like absolute freedom. Elias walked silently beside me, his phone already buzzing with updates from our legal team. We had completely dismantled Calvin's attempt to seize my empire through a fraudulent conservatorship, and the district attorney was already reviewing the forged documents my father had submitted under oath. I slid into the back of my Maybach, sinking into the plush leather seats, and let out a long, slow breath. I thought the war was finally over. I thought crushing my family in open court would be the ultimate end to their toxic reign. But a desperate man is a dangerous man, and Connor was the most desperate of them all. As my driver navigated through the busy downtown traffic, Elias turned to me with a deep frown creasing his forehead. He handed me his tablet showing a series of urgent messages from Marcus Vance. Marcus was the chief executive officer of a massive software company that currently leased 3 entire floors in my flagship commercial tower. He was also one of my most loyal tenants because I had given his company a massive break on rent when they were just a struggling startup 5 years ago. Marcus had sent Elias a voice memo marked urgent. I tapped the screen and pressed the speaker to my ear. "Maya, you need to know what your brother-in-law is doing," Marcus said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Connor just took me and 3 of your other top commercial tenants out to a private lunch at the Capital City Club. He is completely frantic. His tech company is officially dead after you exposed that stolen patent at the gala last week, so now he is trying to pivot into commercial real estate development. He is trying to poach your biggest renters right out from under you." I listened closely as Marcus recounted the entire pathetic lunch meeting. Connor was sweating through his expensive suit, begging these executives to break their leases with my holding company. He was pitching a massive state-of-the-art commercial park that he claimed he was building on the west side of the city. He unrolled glossy architectural renderings and promised them the world if they would just jump ship and sign with him today. Marcus paused on the recording, taking a deep breath. "Maya, you are not going to like what he said next," Marcus warned. Connor got aggressive when we hesitated. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Maya is just a diversity quota success story. My firm has real capital. We can offer you 50% off rent if you sign the transfer agreements and wire the security deposits to my development fund this afternoon." I lowered the tablet, my jaw clenching so tightly my teeth ached. A diversity quota success story. Connor, a man who had entirely funded his pathetic life using money stolen from my late mother's trust fund, had the absolute audacity to reduce my decade of relentless hard work to a diversity quota. He was trying to strip away my legitimate tenants by selling them a fantasy built on his unearned white privilege. He really thought he could just snap his fingers, offer an impossibly low rent, and steal the empire I built from the ground up. Elias looked at me, his expression deadly serious. "Do you want me to file a tortious interference lawsuit?" Elias asked. "He is actively trying to destroy our active commercial leases. We can bury him in litigation before the sun sets." I looked out the tinted window of the Maybach, watching the towering skyscrapers of my city roll past. I felt that familiar cold anger settling deep in my chest, but I did not let it consume me. I channeled it into pure calculated strategy. "No," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Do not sue him, Elias. Call Marcus back right now. Tell him to sign Connor's contract. Tell Marcus to get the other 3 executives to sign their contracts too. Tell them to wire those security deposits directly into Connor's commercial development account immediately." Elias stared at me like I had lost my mind. "Maya, If they sign those contracts, you will lose your 4 biggest tenants in a single afternoon. That represents millions in annual revenue. They are not going anywhere, Elias, I replied, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. Because Connor is an arrogant idiot who never does his own due diligence. I know exactly what plot of land he is talking about on the west side. Calvin looked at buying that same exact parcel 5 years ago, and I did the environmental and historical surveys for him. Tell Marcus to sign the papers and find out where Connor is celebrating tonight. 4 hours later, my driver pulled up to an exclusive underground cigar lounge in the heart of Buckhead. The air inside was thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and aged bourbon. I walked past the host without giving my name and headed straight for the private VIP room in the back. I pushed open the heavy oak doors. Connor was standing at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by my 4 top commercial tenants. He was holding a crystal glass of scotch, laughing loudly, and celebrating his supposed victory. Several thick legal contracts sat in a neat pile on the table next to confirmation receipts of the massive security deposits the executives had just wired to his bank account. Connor saw me walk into the room and his arrogant laughter died in his throat. "What the hell are you doing here?" Connor demanded, setting his glass down heavily. "This is a private celebration, Maya. You lost. Your best tenants just realized that my firm has real capital and real vision. They are moving to my new development." I walked slowly around the table, completely ignoring his pathetic posturing. The 4 executives, including Marcus, sat perfectly still, watching me with knowing eyes. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out a thick stack of certified federal zoning maps and environmental protection orders. I tossed them directly onto the center of the table, right on top of Connor's signed leases. "I am thrilled you found such incredible investors for your new commercial park, Connor," I announced, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. "I am so glad they gave you those massive non-refundable deposits today. I am especially thrilled to sponsor your downfall since your brilliant new development is actually built on a lie. That specific tract of land you just leased to these men is a federally protected historic site." Connor froze, his eyes darting down to the federal seals on the documents I had just thrown on the table. He swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. "You cannot turn a single shovel of dirt on that land, Connor." I continued, stepping closer to him until he was forced to look me in the eye. "It is an active archaeological zone protected by the federal government. You just signed commercial leases and accepted millions of dollars in deposits for buildings that legally can never be constructed. You just committed massive commercial wire fraud and theft by deception." The room erupted. The 4 executives stood up simultaneously, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor. They turned on Connor, their faces furious, realizing he had just lured them into a massive federal crime. Connor backed up against the wood-paneled wall, clutching his chest as he realized he was going to federal prison. News of Connor's disastrous real estate scam broke before the sun even rose the next morning. The 4 executives had immediately contacted their legal teams, and federal authorities were already freezing Connor's development accounts. I watched the local news from my penthouse, sipping my morning coffee, as reporters detailed the collapse of Next Gen Logistics and Connor's subsequent arrest for wire fraud. Valerie and Jasmine were completely silent, hiding behind the gated walls of their mansion, avoiding the furious media circus parked at their front gates. But Calvin could not hide. His own logistics company, the 30-year legacy he had built on the backs of underpaid workers, was bleeding out rapidly. He had relied on Connor's fake tech money to save his failing business, and now that lifeline was completely severed. To make matters worse for my father, the workers at his main distribution warehouses decided that this was the exact moment to walk out. A massive supply chain strike paralyzed Calvin's entire operation just as the morning shift was supposed to begin. Hundreds of truck drivers, forklift operators, and warehouse managers formed heavy picket lines outside his iron gates, refusing to move a single piece of freight. Deliveries halted instantly. High-value contracts were breached within hours. Millions of dollars in perishable and time-sensitive merchandise sat rotting in the relentless Atlanta heat. Calvin was cornered. His empire was crumbling around him, And like a wounded animal, he lashed out at the only person he felt had the power to orchestrate his absolute destruction. Me. I had just finished a highly productive lunch meeting with Elias at a quiet upscale restaurant in Midtown. We were finalizing the integration of my newly acquired commercial properties when I heard the violent screeching of tires. A sleek black town car slammed to a halt, illegally blocking my Maybach in the restaurant parking lot. The driver's side door flew open and Calvin stormed out onto the pavement. His expensive custom suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His silk tie was hanging loose around his neck. His face was a dark, dangerous shade of purple. He marched across the asphalt, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. He did not care who was watching. He did not care about the public spectacle he was creating in the middle of the business district. "You did this!" Calvin screamed, his voice echoing harshly off the brick walls of the parking garage. "You paid them off. You went to the union leaders and you bribed them to strike against my company, did you not?" Elias stepped forward, immediately moving to intervene and protect me, but I held up my hand, stopping him. I stood my ground, looking calmly at the man who had spent his entire life making me feel completely worthless. I watched the frantic panic in his eyes and felt absolutely nothing for him. "You always destroy what you touch." Calvin continued, spitting the angry words at me. "You ruined your own life with your instability, and now you want to ruin my 30-year legacy. You are a vindictive, hateful child, and I will see you in federal prison for industrial sabotage. I will sue you for every penny you have." I let him finish his pathetic tantrum. I watched his chest heave as he tried to catch his breath, leaning heavily on his expensive cane. The sheer arrogance of his accusation was almost laughable to me. He honestly believed the only way his workers would ever stand up to him was if someone paid them to do it. He could not fathom that his own cruelty had consequences. "I did not pay a single union leader to strike against you," I said, my voice perfectly level, contrasting beautifully with his unhinged screaming. "Bribing union officials is highly illegal, and I do not need to break the law to ruin you, Calvin. I simply did what any smart business owner would do in a free market. I sent my human resources team to your picket lines this morning while you were busy panicking in your office. I had them hand out premium employment contracts for my own logistics warehouses." Calvin stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as the reality of my words began to slowly sink into his panicked brain. "You see, father," I continued, stepping closer to him so he could hear every single syllable clearly. "Your workers did not need an illegal bribe to leave your failing company. They just needed a financial lifeline. You have spent decades severely underpaying your most loyal employees. You built your massive fortune on the backs of hardworking Black men and women, paying them 20% below the industry standard, while you and Valerie bought luxury cars and threw $50,000 charity galas to boost your social status. You threatened to fire anyone who asked for a basic living wage, so I simply offered them what they are actually worth in this economy. I offered them full benefits, complete family health care, and a 30% pay raise to come work for my holding company instead." "Your workers are not on strike, Calvin," I explained, watching the very last ounce of arrogance drain entirely from his eyes. "They quit. Every single one of your senior drivers and logistics managers signed contracts with me 2 hours ago. They are currently driving my trucks and moving my freight across the state. You do not have a labor dispute. You have an empty warehouse and 0 staff." Calvin stumbled backward, leaning against the hood of his town car for physical support. He ran a trembling hand over his pale face. He knew his 30-year legacy was completely obliterated in a single morning. He had no workforce, no operating capital, and a looming federal investigation from his failed conservatorship stunt. He was breathing heavily, shaking his head in absolute denial of his new reality. Before he could formulate any kind of response, his cell phone began ringing loudly from inside his suit jacket pocket. He fumbled awkwardly to pull it out. The caller ID displayed the name of his biggest corporate client. The massive retail conglomerate accounted for nearly 60% of his total annual revenue. It was the only active contract keeping his company out of immediate bankruptcy proceedings. Calvin answered the phone, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the device. "Hello?" he said, trying desperately to smooth out his panicked voice and project false confidence. Yes, this is Calvin. Because the parking lot was so incredibly quiet, I could clearly hear the sharp, angry voice of the executive on the other end of the line. The client was absolutely furious. They had essential freight stalled across the entire southeast region and major retail stores waiting for inventory that Calvin could no longer physically deliver. Calvin, I am canceling our master service agreement. Effective immediately, the executive shouted through the phone speaker. We cannot afford these massive supply chain delays. You promised us this strike would be resolved by noon, and now we hear your entire workforce just walked off the property. Please, just give me 24 hours. Calvin begged, the pride entirely stripped from his cracking voice. I can find scab workers. I can get your freight moving tonight, I promise you. I will personally drive the trucks if I have to. Do not bother. The executive interrupted sharply, refusing to hear another excuse. We already found a replacement logistics firm that can handle our massive volume. They guaranteed our shipments will be back on schedule by tomorrow morning. Calvin looked up at me, a look of pure, unadulterated terror washing over his sweating face. Who did you hire? He asked, his voice barely a hollow whisper. A new holding company, the executive replied briskly. They just acquired an entire fleet of experienced drivers today and offered us a highly competitive rate. We are moving all our regional contracts over to their management immediately. I believe the owner is someone named Maya. The line went completely dead. Calvin stood alone in the parking lot, staring blankly at the disconnected phone in his trembling hand. The silence between us was absolute and final. I gave my father one final polite nod, turned around and got back into my Maybach, leaving him completely destroyed in the rearview mirror. I watched my father shrink into the distance through the rearview mirror of my Maybach. The total collapse of his logistics empire was the final nail in the coffin of his manufactured legacy. By sunset, the news of his massive supply chain strike had hit the local business networks. I sat in my penthouse watching the financial anchors dissect the sudden implosion of a 30-year-old Atlanta institution. The anchors speculated wildly about what had caused the massive walkout, but I knew the exact truth. My phone screen lit up with messages from my human resources team confirming that every single one of Calvin's former drivers had successfully completed their onboarding at my warehouses. The transition was flawless. My logistics network was now the most powerful in the state, while Calvin's was reduced to empty concrete shells. But while I was securing my new empire, my stepmother Valerie was descending into absolute madness. Valerie had always been the true architect of my family's cruelty. Calvin was arrogant, but Valerie was venomous. With Connor's fake tech company destroyed and Calvin's logistics money completely gone, Valerie was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. She was facing the loss of her mansion, her country club memberships, and her designer wardrobe. I knew she would not just sit quietly and accept defeat. She was a cornered snake, and I knew exactly where she would try to strike next. Late that evening, the security monitoring system on my phone sent me a silent alert. It was just past midnight, and the downtown corporate offices of my holding company were completely dark and deserted. I had specifically instructed my overnight security team to leave the service elevator unlocked and the camera feeds running. I wanted to give Valerie a perfectly clear path to hang herself. My head of security, Elias, sent me a text confirming that a woman matching Valerie's description had just slipped through the loading dock doors. She had paid off a disgruntled former janitor to get the access codes to the lower levels. She took the service elevator straight up to the executive floor and stepped out into the dark, carpeted hallway. She was wearing head-to-toe black cashmere and carrying a small leather tote bag. She looked utterly ridiculous trying to play the role of a corporate spy in her designer clothes. She clicked on a small pen light, holding it between her teeth as she expertly picked the standard lock on my office door. She did not know that the lock was a prop installed specifically for her visit. I had removed the biometric scanners just for this occasion. Valerie crept into my massive corner office and immediately went to work. The moonlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the room. She began frantically tearing through my filing cabinets, pulling out vendor contracts and empty tax folders. She was looking for anything she could use to blackmail me. She needed leverage to force me to give them back the penthouse and the trust fund money. She pulled open my desk drawers, tossing expensive stationery and corporate binders onto the floor in her desperate search. The glow of her penlight illuminated her furious, sweating face. She slammed a drawer shut and moved toward the private credenza against the far wall. "Little brat thought she could outsmart me," Valerie muttered to herself, her voice trembling with rage as she yanked on the brass handles. "I ran this family before she even knew how to spell business. I built our social standing from nothing, while she was just a pathetic, depressed college dropout playing with finger paints. I tolerated her miserable existence in my house for years. I will find whatever she is hiding and I will destroy her. She just got lucky, and now she thinks she is untouchable. She is nothing without the name we gave her." She ripped through the upper drawers, finding nothing but blank paper and basic office supplies. Her frustration was palpable. She was breathing heavily, her manicured nails chipping as she clawed at the wood. Valerie finally pried open the bottom drawer of the credenza. She let out a sharp gasp of victory as her flashlight beam hit a thick, heavy red folder marked "Strictly Confidential." She grabbed it with greedy, shaking hands, pressing it against her chest like a lifeline. She thought she had found the ultimate weapon. She probably imagined it contained proof of tax evasion or illegal shell companies that she could march straight to the authorities. She turned around, ready to sneak back out into the night and reclaim her throne as the untouchable matriarch of Atlanta society. Then the overhead fluorescent lights snapped on with a loud electronic hum. The massive corner office was instantly flooded with blinding white light. Valerie shrieked and dropped her flashlight, shielding her eyes with a manicured hand. As her vision slowly adjusted, she saw me. I was sitting perfectly still in the high-back leather chair in the darkest corner of the room. I had been sitting there in the pitch black for over an hour, simply waiting for her to arrive. Two of my largest private security contractors stepped out from the shadows near the doorway, crossing their massive arms over their chests. They blocked her only exit. Valerie froze, completely paralyzed, like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. "You always were incredibly predictable, Valerie," I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on my large mahogany desk. "You really thought you could just bribe a janitor and walk into my corporate headquarters without tripping a dozen silent alarms? Did you honestly believe I would leave sensitive blackmail material sitting in an unlocked credenza?" Valerie's chest heaved as she clutched the red folder tighter. "You cannot stop me, Maya," she stammered, trying to project a confidence she did not possess. "I have the proof right here. I have your confidential files, and I am walking out of here with them. If your goons try to touch me, I will scream until the police arrive. I will tell them you assaulted me. I will expose whatever filthy secrets you have hidden in these pages, and I will make sure you lose every single penny you stole from us." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. I stood up from my chair and slowly walked around to the front of my desk, holding out my hand. Valerie clutched the folder tighter, stepping backward until she hit the wall. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. "You are holding a decoy folder, Valerie," I explained calmly. "I printed those pages specifically for you because I knew you would come crawling in here looking for dirt. But I decided to put something much more interesting inside it than fake tax returns. Open it." Valerie stared at me, her eyes darting between me and the security guards. Her hands were shaking violently as she flipped open the heavy red cover. She looked down at the first page, and all the blood instantly drained from her face. Her mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. She dropped the folder onto the carpet, as if it had physically burned her. I looked down at the scattered papers displaying decades of hidden wire transfers and offshore account numbers. The detailed ledgers showed exactly how she had systematically drained Calvin's logistics company over the years. "Looking for this?" I asked, tilting my head as I watched her entire world shatter. "It is the offshore bank account where you have been hiding money from Dad for the last 10 years. You have been siphoning millions out of his business and hiding it in the Cayman Islands while he slowly went bankrupt. You stole from your own husband while you both mocked me for being poor." I stepped closer to her, lowering my voice to a sharp whisper. "Should I call him? Or do you want to?" Valerie stared at the papers on the floor like they were coated in toxic poison. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble so violently she could not even pick up the scattered pages. She knew that Calvin would absolutely destroy her if he found out she had been siphoning millions from his company while he faced federal indictments and bankruptcy. She dropped to her knees right there on the plush carpet of my corporate office, begging me to keep her secret. She sobbed heavily, ruining her expensive designer makeup, and pleading for mercy from the stepdaughter she had tormented for decades. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her. I simply turned my back, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, and told my security team to escort her out of the building. I told her she had exactly 24 hours to pack her bags and leave the city before I mailed those financial ledgers directly to Calvin's personal attorney. The silence in my office after she was dragged away, kicking and screaming, was incredibly peaceful. The fallout from the gala and Connor's arrest continued to completely dominate the local news cycle over the next few days. My sister Jasmine was learning very quickly that being an internet influencer only works when you have actual wealth to show off. Her entire brand was built on projecting an image of flawless luxury, but the public now knew that her husband was facing decades in federal prison for commercial wire fraud. The luxury brands that used to sponsor her social media posts began dropping her one by one. High-end cosmetics companies and designer fashion houses publicly severed their ties with her, releasing statements that they did not want their products associated with a criminal enterprise. Jasmine was losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in brand deals every single day. She was spiraling into absolute panic because she had absolutely no life skills and no way to generate her own income. She had always relied on my father or Connor to fund her lavish lifestyle, and now both of those men were completely broke. I was sitting in my penthouse library later that week, enjoying a quiet evening with a book, when my private elevator chimed. I frowned because I was not expecting any visitors. My security team usually announced anyone coming up, but Jasmine had apparently caused such a hysterical scene in the lobby that the new concierge just sent her up to avoid calling the police. The elevator door slid open and Jasmine stumbled into my foyer. She looked absolutely dreadful. Her expensive blonde hair was tangled and her face was stained with dark streaks of running mascara. She was wearing a wrinkled silk tracksuit and carrying a massive designer duffel bag stuffed with her belongings. She dropped the heavy bag onto my marble floor and immediately burst into loud, dramatic tears. She ran across the room and tried to throw her arms around me, but I stepped back, letting her stumble. She caught herself on the back of my leather sofa, gasping for air as she launched into her desperate pitch. "You have to help me, Maya," she sobbed, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "You are my big sister. You have to protect me." Connor lied to me about everything. He told me he was a tech genius, but he is just a fraud. And now the feds have frozen all our bank accounts. Dad is going completely broke and his workers abandoned him. I have absolutely nothing left. I need to move in here with you, just until things blow over. I need a safe place to stay, and I need an allowance to maintain my lifestyle. Maya, you owe me that much because we are family. I stared at her in absolute disbelief. She was standing in the penthouse she had repeatedly tried to steal from me, demanding that I pay for her luxury lifestyle because her scam artist husband got caught. I did not yell or lose my temper. I walked over to the wet bar in the corner of the library and slowly poured myself a glass of expensive red wine. I took a long, deliberate sip and turned back to face my hysterical sister. "I am not giving you a single penny, Jasmine," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "You do not get to torment me my entire life, and then demand an allowance when your fake empire collapses." Jasmine wiped her eyes and immediately shifted from playing the victim to acting completely offended. "How can you be so cruel to your own sister?" she demanded. "I have never done anything to hurt you, Maya. I have always been your biggest supporter behind closed doors." I smiled and set my wine glass down on the marble counter. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. I had an audio file ready and waiting. I pressed play and let the high-definition recording echo through the quiet library. It was a recording from an exclusive Buckhead salon, taken just yesterday afternoon. Jasmine's shrill, arrogant voice filled the room, clearly talking to her hairstylist. "I do not care about Maya," she was saying on the recording. "She is just a lucky, ugly bitch who will end up completely alone. I am going to manipulate her into paying my bills until Connor gets out of trouble. She is pathetic and desperate for a family, so it will be incredibly easy." Jasmine froze, listening to her own hateful words. She stopped crying immediately, the fake tears drying up as she stared at me in sheer terror. She realized that I had people watching her every move. I owned the building where her luxury salon was located, and the staff was extremely loyal to me. She had just walked into my home and lied to my face, while I held the absolute proof of her deception. I picked my wine glass back up and took another sip, watching her struggle to formulate a lie to cover up her own recorded words. Before Jasmine could even open her mouth, the heavy oak doors of my penthouse staircase violently burst open. Connor stood in the doorway looking like a deranged animal. His expensive suit was torn, his tie was missing, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild. He was breathing heavily, gripping the doorframe with white knuckles. He had bypassed building security by sneaking up the emergency fire escape stairs. Connor glared at his wife with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "I tracked your phone location?" "Jasmine," he snarled, stepping into the room. "You actually came here to beg her for money and throw me under the bus, did you not? You thought you could just abandon me and play the victim?" Jasmine backed away from him, terrified by his erratic behavior. "Connor, I can explain," she stammered, her hands trembling. "Do not bother explaining anything," Connor shouted, taking another menacing step forward. "You think you can leave me to take the fall for the logistics fraud while you live in luxury? No, we are in this together, Jasmine. I know you have been planning to testify against me to save yourself, but you are not innocent." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black flash drive, holding it up for both of us to see. "You are not just a victim, Jasmine." He laughed, a dark, humorless sound. "I secretly recorded you admitting that you helped me forge the original tech patent documents. You signed the federal paperwork right alongside me. If I am going down for this massive federal crime, my beautiful, loyal wife is coming right down with me." I stood silently by the wet bar, watching my sister and my brother-in-law turn on each other like starved wolves. They had spent their entire relationship building a facade of wealth and superiority. But now they were ready to tear each other apart, just to save themselves. Jasmine stared at the small black flash drive in Connor's hand, knowing that her entire life of luxury was completely over. She was going to face federal fraud charges right alongside the husband she despised. The police sirens began to echo faintly from the city streets below my penthouse, closing in on them. I took another sip of my wine and enjoyed the show. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the expensive modern artwork on my penthouse walls. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass window and watched silently as federal agents escorted Connor and Jasmine out of the luxury building in heavy metal handcuffs. They were screaming at each other the entire time, throwing vicious, angry accusations back and forth as the local news reporters snapped hundreds of invasive photographs. Their entire lives of stolen privilege and manufactured superiority were completely over. They had built a massive, fragile house of cards, and I had just casually knocked over the very last piece. I finished my glass of expensive red wine and turned away from the window. I had to get some rest because tomorrow was going to be the absolute most important day of my entire professional career. The sun rose over the Atlanta skyline the next morning, bringing a humid, heavy heat that perfectly matched the intense pressure currently crushing my father's company. Calvin's 30-year-old logistics empire was in absolute freefall. The massive supply chain strike I orchestrated the previous day had permanently crippled his main distribution centers. His largest corporate clients had completely abandoned him overnight, pulling their massive contracts and moving their business directly to my firm. His entire fleet of delivery trucks were sitting empty in the vast commercial parking lots, gathering dust, while my own company completely dominated the regional market. The board of directors at his logistics firm had officially panicked. They called an emergency executive board meeting for 10 o'clock that morning specifically to vote on removing Calvin as chief executive officer. I stood in front of my large bedroom mirror, adjusting the sharp collar of my tailored dark gray power suit. Elias walked into the room looking completely professional and handed me a thick, heavy leather portfolio. It contained the final verified ownership documents for a private equity firm I had quietly acquired 3 years ago, called Apex Holdings. We had kept my ownership entirely anonymous, using complex layers of corporate shell companies and blind trusts. I knew this exact day would eventually come, and I had prepared for it with absolute surgical precision. My private driver pulled the Maybach up to the tall glass facade of Calvin's corporate headquarters. The massive commercial building was eerily quiet without the usual loud fleet of delivery trucks blocking the busy loading docks. The entire property felt exactly like a massive corporate graveyard. Elias and I walked past the empty, abandoned reception desk and took the private executive elevator straight up to the top floor. The heavy, thick mahogany doors of the primary boardroom were closed tight, but I could clearly hear Calvin's booming, desperate voice echoing down the empty, carpeted hallway. He was practically shouting, trying to overpower the loud, angry voices of his own board of directors. The 12 men and women sitting around that long, polished table were furious. They were watching their lucrative stock options plummet and their massive retirement funds evaporate rapidly because of his complete stubborn incompetence. I signaled for Elias to wait a moment so I could listen to my father blindly dig his own professional grave. "You are all completely overreacting," Calvin yelled, slamming his heavy fist against the expensive wood table. "We are merely experiencing a minor temporary labor dispute that will be entirely resolved by the end of the week. You cannot simply vote to remove me from the company I built from the absolute ground up. I will not allow you to steal my legacy over a few delayed shipping crates." The board members muttered angrily among themselves, demanding actual concrete proof of his supposed financial recovery plan. Calvin puffed out his chest, adjusting his expensive silk tie with a trembling, nervous hand. He wiped a large bead of sweat from his forehead, trying desperately to project authority. "You all know I have successfully dealt with incredibly difficult situations before," Calvin boasted loudly. "My daughter Maya may be a disappointment, but my business acumen has secured a $20 million bailout from Apex Holdings. I am saving this company." I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open, letting them hit the walls with a loud, definitive thud. The entire room went completely dead silent. 12 angry, desperate board members turned their heads to stare at me in absolute shock. Calvin froze right at the head of the table, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple as he saw me casually walk into his sacred boardroom. Elias stepped into the room right behind me, carrying my thick leather portfolio. "What the hell are you doing in here?" Calvin demanded, his voice shaking with a volatile mixture of rage and absolute terror. "This is a restricted private executive meeting, Maya. Building security should have never let you pass the front lobby. Get out of my building right now before I have you arrested and thrown in jail for corporate espionage." I completely ignored his desperate screaming. I walked slowly and deliberately down the entire length of the long boardroom table. The expensive leather chairs creaked loudly as the board members shifted uncomfortably, watching my every single move. I reached the head of the table and stopped right next to my father. He smelled like stale, dark coffee and terrified, nervous sweat. He tried to physically block me from the main executive chair, but Elias immediately stepped forward, imposing his massive frame firmly between us. Calvin stumbled backward, clutching his chest as he realized he had absolutely no physical power left in this room. I took the leather portfolio from Elias and opened it slowly. I pulled out the certified banking documents and the official state registration forms. I tossed them onto the center of the mahogany table, right on top of Calvin's messy stack of useless fake financial projections. The senior board member, a stern older woman named Margaret, picked up the heavy documents and adjusted her reading glasses. Her eyes widened massively as she read the bold black ink on the first page. She looked up at me, her jaw dropping slightly in pure shock. Calvin watched her reaction, his breathing becoming shallow and incredibly ragged. "What are those papers?" Calvin asked, his voice cracking pathetically. I turned to face the entire board of directors, resting my hands flat on the smooth wood table. "I bought that private equity firm 3 years ago using the massive profits from my commercial real estate ventures. I hid my total ownership behind corporate trusts because I knew that one day my incredibly arrogant father would desperately need a financial bailout, and he would never accept money from the daughter he deemed a complete failure." Calvin gasped loudly, clutching the back of a leather chair just to keep from collapsing onto the carpeted floor. He realized he had just bragged to the entire board about securing rescue money from his own daughter. He realized his final desperate lifeline was an absolute trap that I had set for him years ago. The board members stared at me, waiting eagerly for my next move. They did not care about our toxic family drama, they only cared about saving their massive personal investments. I looked directly into Calvin's wide, terrified eyes. "I am the angel investor," I stated clearly. "And my first condition for the bailout is the immediate uncompensated termination of Calvin as CEO." The boardroom erupted into frantic, excited whispers as the directors quickly realized I was offering them a perfect, clean way out of their financial nightmare. Margaret slammed her hand hard on the table, calling for an immediate official vote. Every single hand in the room went up in perfect, fast unison. The board voted unanimously in my favor, stripping Calvin of his entire company, his massive executive salary, and his 30-year legacy in a matter of seconds. I walked out of the towering corporate headquarters, leaving the completely shattered remains of the boardroom behind me. The heavy glass doors slid shut, severing my ties to the logistics empire my father had wrongfully built. The crisp autumn air hit my face as Elias opened the heavy door of the Maybach waiting at the curb. We had executed the plan flawlessly. 30 years of Calvin's tyrannical rule over his employees and his own family was completely erased by a single unanimous vote from a panicked board of directors. I sat in the plush leather seat watching the busy Atlanta streets pass by my tinted windows, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace settling deep in my chest. But I knew the war was not entirely finished yet. Calvin and Valerie still had their ultimate fortress. They still had the massive Buckhead mansion where they had spent 2 decades making me feel like an unwanted stray dog. Back at the sprawling luxury estate Valerie was living in, a state of complete and utter delusion. While Calvin was physically losing his entire corporate empire downtown, Valerie was frantically running around their massive marble foyer, barking ridiculous orders at their terrified household staff. Thanksgiving was only a few days away, and Valerie absolutely refused to cancel her legendary annual holiday gala. She believed with every fiber of her being that maintaining absolute social perfection was the only way to survive a massive public scandal. Jasmine was sitting halfway up the grand sweeping staircase, wrapped tightly in an expensive silk robe. She was sobbing uncontrollably into her phone as she tried desperately to reach Connor's criminal defense attorney. Her fraudster husband was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, and her personal bank accounts were completely frozen, but Valerie simply did not care about her daughter's panic. Valerie marched past Jasmine carrying a massive binder thick with expensive catering menus and imported floral arrangements. "Stand up and stop crying like a pathetic child," Valerie snapped at Jasmine, waving a hand dismissively at the household staff carrying heavy boxes of crystal champagne flutes. "We will host the mayor. We will show Atlanta that we are untouched by that crazy girl's tantrums. Maya might have pulled a lucky stunt in the boardroom today, but she cannot touch our real wealth. We are old money and we do not break a sweat over minor corporate setbacks." Calvin stumbled through the heavy double front doors just as Valerie was lecturing the private chef about the truffle-infused turkey stuffing. Calvin's face was pale and ashen. His silk tie was missing and his suit jacket was draped carelessly over his arm. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire life burn completely to the ground. Valerie ignored his heavily disheveled appearance, immediately shoving a gold-embossed guest list right into his chest. Calvin, I need you to call the country club and confirm that the string quartet is arriving by 4 o'clock on Thursday, she demanded, completely oblivious to his utter destruction. I will not have Maya and her pathetic little revenge plot ruin our social standing. We are going to throw the most lavish Thanksgiving this city has ever seen. Calvin just stared at her, his eyes hollow and empty. He walked slowly past her, dropping his heavy leather briefcase onto the marble floor with a loud thud. He headed straight for his private mahogany study, shuffling his feet like a completely broken man. Valerie rolled her eyes and turned back to the terrified catering staff, clapping her manicured hands sharply to keep them moving faster. The massive kitchen smelled strongly of roasting meats and expensive baking spices. Hired florists were busy setting up towering arrangements of white orchids and imported roses across the massive dining room table. Valerie was determined to bury their harsh reality under thick layers of expensive silk tablecloths and vintage wine. She honestly believed that if the mayor sat at her table and ate her food, the rest of Atlanta society would completely ignore the fact that her husband had just been ousted for gross incompetence, and her son-in-law was a known federal criminal. Right in the middle of this frantic, chaotic preparation, the heavy brass knocker on the front double doors echoed loudly through the grand foyer. Valerie smiled brightly, smoothing down her designer dress. She assumed it was the exclusive wine merchant delivering the expensive cases of vintage champagne she had special ordered just to impress the mayor. I will get it, Valerie announced, waving away the butler who had stepped forward. She pulled open the massive wooden doors, putting on her absolute best artificial socialite smile. But it was not the wine merchant standing on the steps. A tall, stern-looking man in a cheap gray suit stood on the front porch, holding a thick manila envelope. He looked past Valerie, taking in the chaotic scene of catered luxury happening inside the foyer. Are you Valerie or Calvin? He asked, his voice completely flat and professional. I am the lady of the house, Valerie answered, her smile dropping instantly as she looked the man up and down with clear disgust. Deliveries go around to the service entrance in the back. You are tracking dirt onto my imported marble floors. The man did not move a single inch. I am not a delivery driver, Mom, he stated, pulling a cheap pen from his breast pocket. I am a court-appointed process server. I have an urgent legal notice for Calvin and all current residents of this property. Calvin heard the loud commotion from his study and slowly walked out into the foyer. He looked at the man in the gray suit, and the remaining color instantly drained from his already pale face. He knew exactly what this was. He reached out with a trembling, shaking hand and took the thick manila envelope directly from the process server. You have been officially served, the man said, turning around and walking back down the long driveway without saying another word. Valerie scoffed, snatching the envelope right out of Calvin's shaking hands. What is this nonsense? She demanded, ripping the top open roughly. Is this another one of Maya's ridiculous little lawsuits? She cannot sue us for hosting a Thanksgiving dinner, Calvin. Tell your useless corporate lawyers to handle this immediately. Valerie pulled the heavy stack of legal documents out of the envelope and began reading the bold black print on the very first page. Her eyes darted rapidly across the dense legal paragraphs. The custom floral arrangements and the smell of roasting turkey suddenly meant absolutely nothing. Her hands began to shake so violently that she dropped several pages directly onto the marble floor. Calvin, what is this? Valerie whispered, her voice trembling with rising frantic panic. Why does this say notice of immediate foreclosure? We own this house outright. Calvin leaned heavily against the painted wall, unable to look his furious wife in the eye. We did own it, he mumbled, his voice completely defeated. But I needed liquid capital to back Connor's new tech startup last month. Connor promised me the returns would be astronomical. He said we would triple our entire investment in mere weeks. So I quietly used the deed to this estate as collateral for a massive high-interest bridge loan to fund his development accounts. Jasmine gasped loudly from the staircase, dropping her expensive phone as she realized her own husband was the exact reason they were losing the family mansion. "Connor is a total fraud!" Calvin Valerie screamed, her voice echoing wildly off the high ceilings. "The Fed seized all of his bank accounts yesterday. The bank is foreclosing on our home because you bet our entire estate on a fake company." "It gets much worse," Calvin said, closing his eyes as hot tears of absolute defeat spilled down his cheeks. "The bank panicked when the news of his arrest broke this morning. They immediately auctioned off our distressed debt to a private holding company to quickly recoup their massive losses." Valerie dropped to her knees, frantically scrambling to pick up the fallen legal papers from the cold marble floor. She flipped violently to the final page, looking for the name of the new property owner who had just purchased their debt. She stared at the bold signature line and let out a guttural, horrifying scream. The newly registered owner of the sprawling Buckhead estate, the person who now held the absolute legal right to kick them out into the cold streets, was none other than Apex Holdings, my company. I had bought the debt for absolute pennies on the dollar the exact second Calvin's creditors panicked. I was now the sole legal owner of the mansion where I had suffered for over 2 decades. Valerie stared at the final bold paragraph of the legal notice, reading the terrible words through her hysterical tears. The document was an absolute unconditional eviction mandate. They had exactly 48 hours to vacate. The grand foyer of the sprawling Buckhead estate was completely silent, except for the sound of Valerie's frantic sobbing echoing off the high marble walls. Calvin stood frozen, completely paralyzed by the realization that his massive corporate failure had just cost him his family home. The expensive catering staff, who had been busily preparing a lavish Thanksgiving feast, slowly stopped what they were doing. They whispered among themselves, realizing that a family facing an immediate foreclosure eviction would definitely not be paying their expensive catering invoices. One by one, the private chefs and the florists packed up their equipment and walked right out the front door, leaving the half-cooked turkey and the imported orchids abandoned in the massive kitchen. Connor watched this entire pathetic scene unfold from the dark shadows of the second-floor landing. He saw the complete destruction of Calvin's 30-year empire, and he knew the federal walls were rapidly closing in around him. Connor was a coward who only cared about his own survival. He quietly backed away from the mahogany railing and slipped into his luxury guest suite. He pulled a heavy leather duffel bag from the back of his closet and began frantically stuffing it with his expensive designer watches and the few stacks of emergency cash he kept hidden in a wall safe. He had spent the last 2 hours secretly transferring the absolute final drops of funding from his fake tech startup into a personal offshore account located in Boston. He zipped the heavy leather bag shut and slipped out the back service doors of the mansion completely undetected by his panicking in-laws. He climbed into his sleek silver sports car and sped away into the dark, humid Atlanta night, leaving his frantic wife completely alone to face the devastating consequences of their mutual federal crimes. I was sitting at my glass dining table in my downtown penthouse, reviewing the final integration files for my newly acquired logistics drivers. My private security team had installed highly advanced tracking software on Connor's phone the exact moment he fled my penthouse days ago. My head of security, Elias, walked into the dining room and placed a secure tablet directly in front of me. He tapped the screen, opening a live audio intercept of Connor's phone lines. I pressed play and listened intently to the desperate, pathetic phone call happening between my sister and her fleeing husband. Jasmine had finally noticed that Connor's car was missing from the mansion garage. She was sobbing hysterically into the phone, begging Connor to tell her where he was going and how they were supposed to survive without Calvin's massive wealth. Connor sounded incredibly cold and completely detached as he drove down the interstate toward the airport. He laughed a dark, arrogant laugh. He told her she was entirely on her own now that the money was completely gone. "You people are toxic," Connor said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "I am going back to my family in Boston, where people actually know how to do real business. I am taking the last of the startup funds, and I am leaving on the first available flight. Deal with your crazy sister yourself, Jasmine." Jasmine screamed into the receiver, promising him that she would tell the police everything about his fake tech company, but Connor just mocked her, telling her no one would ever believe a spoiled princess over a sophisticated businessman. He hung up the phone, instantly severing their marriage. He was planning to let her take the entire legal fall for the forged tech patent documents they had illegally signed together. He honestly believed he was walking away a free, wealthy man. I sat in my penthouse listening to the dial tone echo through the tablet. I smiled, taking a slow sip of my morning coffee. Connor had always been the weakest link in their pathetic chain, and watching him break was incredibly satisfying. Connor strode into the bright, bustling international terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, feeling completely invincible. He adjusted the collar of his expensive designer jacket and walked straight past the long lines of regular travelers. He marched directly up to the premier first-class ticketing counter, demanding a direct red-eye flight to Boston. He pulled out his heavy metal black card and slapped it onto the smooth white counter, expecting the airline agent to immediately bow to his perceived wealth and superior social status. But Connor did not realize that I had spent the last 48 hours working directly with my elite corporate legal team. We had filed a massive emergency federal injunction, attaching his personal offshore accounts directly to my stolen patent lawsuit. The polite airline agent swiped his heavy metal card through the machine and frowned in confusion. She typed a few keys on her computer terminal and politely informed him that the card was completely declined. Connor scoffed, arrogantly rolling his eyes at the woman. He pulled out a second platinum credit card from his expensive leather wallet. He told the woman to run it again, claiming it was just a minor bank error caused by his massive wealth management team. The machine beeped loudly, displaying another bright red declined message. Connor snatched his phone out of his pocket and frantically opened his mobile banking applications. His smug, arrogant face turned completely white as he stared at the glowing screen. Every single one of his personal and business accounts displayed a massive negative balance. Large red letters indicated a strict federal hold had been placed on his entire portfolio. My lawyers had successfully frozen every single penny he had to his name, including the stolen startup funds he had just tried to hide in Boston. He was entirely broke and completely stranded in the middle of the busy airport terminal. He began screaming loudly at the ticketing agent, pounding his fists on the counter and demanding to speak to a senior manager. He caused a massive, embarrassing scene, drawing the attention of hundreds of early morning travelers who stopped to watch the wealthy man throw a pathetic public tantrum. But the people who confidently approached him from behind were not airline managers. Two tall, heavily built men wearing dark suits and serious expressions stepped up right behind his shoulder. They reached into their suit jackets and flashed heavy gold badges. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been tracking his frantic movements all night long. Connor tried to step backward, but the federal agents firmly grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back. He thought he was only dealing with a minor civil lawsuit over a stolen tech patent. He had absolutely no idea that I had taken the decoy folder Valerie tried to steal and handed the real forged financial documents directly over to the federal authorities. I did not just sue him civilly, I gave the FBI ironclad proof of his massive federal wire fraud and illegal money laundering operations. The cold metal handcuffs clicked loudly, locking his wrists together. Connor was slammed hard against the ticketing counter right in front of hundreds of watching passengers. He wept like a child as the agents read him his rights and dragged him out of the airport in heavy chains. He was going to spend the rest of his life locked inside a federal penitentiary, knowing that the diversity quota success story was the one who put him there. The news of Connor's extremely public arrest at the international terminal completely shattered whatever tiny shred of sanity Jasmine had left. She was officially a penniless social pariah, sitting entirely alone in a cheap roadside motel room because she had exactly 0 hours left on her eviction notice from the sprawling Buckhead mansion. Her fraudster husband was locked inside a cold federal holding cell, facing decades in prison, and her parents were completely bankrupt and hiding from the aggressive local media. Jasmine realized she had absolutely no money and no powerful men left to manipulate, So she fell back on the absolute only talent she ever truly possessed, which was playing the helpless innocent victim for public sympathy. She decided her only way out of this total nightmare was to completely destroy my public reputation and paint me as an evil, heartless monster who stole her family inheritance. Jasmine reached out to the senior editor of Atlanta Elite, an incredibly popular and highly respected local lifestyle magazine that frequently covered wealthy, high society families. She promised them an absolute bombshell exclusive sit-down interview detailing the dark toxic secrets of the Calvin Logistics empire collapse. She dressed herself in a cheap, poorly fitting, oversized sweater to look purposefully fragile and exhausted. She wanted the bright studio cameras to capture her looking like a tragic broken woman who had been cruelly victimized by her deeply jealous and vindictive older sister. She walked into the sleek, modern downtown recording studio, ready to spill her completely fabricated sob story to the eager lead reporter who was sitting across from her with a digital recorder and a sympathetic smile. Jasmine immediately turned on her manufactured waterworks, the exact second the red recording light blinked on. She sobbed dramatically, burying her face in her trembling hands and weaving a completely insane narrative about how I had ruthlessly plotted to steal her childhood home out of pure spite. She completely ignored the fact that her own husband committed massive federal wire fraud and instead blamed me for everything. She told the reporter that I was a cold, vicious billionaire who orchestrated the entire downfall of our father just to watch them suffer in poverty. Then she decided to drop her ultimate, absolutely despicable lie to guarantee maximum public outrage. She placed a shaking hand over her completely flat stomach and looked tearfully directly into the camera lens. She has millions, but she let her own pregnant sister get evicted. Jasmine cried loudly, her voice shaking with fake despair. She told the reporter she was expecting her first child and that her evil sister had happily thrown a vulnerable pregnant woman out into the cold streets without a single ounce of mercy. I stood quietly in the dark control room behind the two-way glass watching my sister commit absolute social suicide. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her disgusting manipulative lies. I slowly pushed open the heavy acoustic door and walked directly into the bright studio lights. Jasmine completely froze mid-sob, her fake tears instantly drying up as she stared at me in pure, unadulterated terror. The lead reporter did not look surprised at all. Instead, she immediately stood up from her leather chair and offered me a polite, respectful nod. Jasmine looked frantically between the reporter and me, her shallow breathing hitching in her throat as she realized something was incredibly wrong. She demanded to know what I was doing, interrupting her exclusive private interview. I casually pulled up a leather chair and sat directly across from my hyperventilating sister. I did not raise my voice or show any emotion at all. I simply looked at her and calmly explained that my massive private equity firm, Apex Holdings, had quietly purchased the parent company of Atlanta Elite magazine nearly 8 months ago. I was the absolute sole owner of the entire publishing group. I paid the reporter's salary, and I controlled every single word that went to print. Jasmine sank back into her chair, her face turning a sickly shade of gray as the crushing reality hit her. She had just voluntarily walked directly into my own building and tried to sell a fake story to my own dedicated employees. But I was not completely finished destroying her pathetic little performance. I reached into my tailored designer suit jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed medical folder, placing it directly on the glass table between us. I told Jasmine that when my elite corporate legal team sued Connor and seized his assets, they also subpoenaed all of their joint financial and insurance records as part of the federal wire fraud discovery process. My lawyers had obtained copies of her recent medical evaluations directly from her luxury private clinic. I tapped the heavy folder with my manicured fingernail and told the reporter that the official medical documents explicitly confirmed that Jasmine was absolutely not pregnant. She had completely fabricated a fake child just to manipulate the media and steal sympathy from the gullible public. Jasmine's jaw dropped open in absolute shock. She started stuttering and stammering, trying desperately to backtrack and invent a new pathetic lie, but the reporter just stared at her with complete professional disgust. I stood up from the table, adjusting my dark gray power suit, and looked down at the pathetic, shivering woman who used to torment me for fun. I told the security guards to physically escort Jasmine out of my building because the interview was officially over. She screamed and thrashed wildly as they dragged her out of the recording studio, throwing vicious, angry curses at me as the heavy acoustic doors slammed shut behind her. The reporter looked at me and asked how we should proceed with the scheduled publication. I smiled a cold, sharp smile and told her to write the absolute truth. I wanted every single ugly detail of their scam exposed to the public. The very next morning, the magazine dropped a massive digital and print exposé that completely broke the local internet. The front cover featured a highly unflattering photograph of Jasmine crying aggressively outside the evicted mansion. The bold, massive headline read, "The Fake Influencer and the Fraudulent Tech Bro," detailing every single aspect of their criminal enterprise and their pathetic, desperate lies. Jasmine's reputation was completely annihilated, and there was absolutely nowhere left for her to hide in this entire city. The fallout from the magazine expose was absolute perfection. I sat in the corner booth of the most exclusive French restaurant in downtown Atlanta, enjoying a quiet, celebratory dinner. The soft ambient lighting and the gentle hum of wealthy patrons provided a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I had just unleashed upon my former family. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, savoring the profound silence that came with total victory. My private security chief, Elias, stood a few feet away, keeping a watchful eye on the elegant dining room. I was just about to order my main course when the heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open violently. Valerie stormed into the dining room looking like an absolute madwoman. Her usually flawless blonde hair was completely unkempt and frizzy, sticking out in wild directions. Her expensive designer dress was wrinkled and stained, as if she had been wearing it for 3 days straight. She marched directly past the horrified host, pushing her way through the maze of elegant tables. The other wealthy diners stopped eating and stared in pure shock as the former queen of Atlanta high society stumbled through the restaurant, looking like a desperate vagrant. Elias immediately stepped forward to block her path, but I raised my hand, signaling him to let her pass. I wanted to see exactly what kind of pathetic, desperate play she had left. Valerie slid roughly into the leather booth directly across from me, knocking over an empty wine glass. In her frantic haste, she leaned across the pristine white tablecloth, her eyes completely bloodshot and wild with pure, venomous hatred. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she glared at me. I did not flinch. I simply folded my hands perfectly in my lap and waited for her to speak. "You think you have won," Valerie hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You think you can just buy our family mansion and throw us out into the street like common trash. Calvin is completely ruined. Jasmine is the laughingstock of the entire internet, and now you are trying to make me homeless. I will not allow you to destroy my life. Maya, I will not let you take away my home and my social standing. We are supposed to be hosting the mayor for Thanksgiving dinner in 2 days, and I refuse to cancel it." I stared at her, completely unfazed by her pathetic manufactured outrage. "I am not taking anything away from you, Valerie," I stated calmly. "You and Calvin gambled your entire estate on a fraudulent criminal enterprise. I simply purchased the distressed debt from the bank. You are being evicted because of your own massive, blinding greed. You enabled Connor's scam, and now you are paying the ultimate price." Valerie slammed her hands down on the table, causing the expensive silverware to rattle loudly. She leaned in even closer, until I could smell the stale, bitter wine on her breath. "You are going to call your lawyers right now, and sign that mansion deed back over to me," Valerie demanded, her voice dropping to a vicious, sinister whisper. "Or else, I am going to completely destroy the one thing you actually care about in this world." I raised an eyebrow, slightly amused by her hollow threats. "You have absolutely nothing left to threaten me with. Valerie, your entire empire is gone. Your money is gone, and your reputation is completely shattered. She smiled a dark, twisted smile that made her look genuinely evil. I have a secret, Maya. A massive, scandalous secret about your precious biological mother. Valerie sneered, watching my face closely for any sign of weakness. If you do not give us the mansion back, I will tell the whole city your saint of a mother was a tramp. I will go to every single news outlet and gossip blog in Atlanta and tell them she was having a massive, disgusting affair behind Calvin's back before she died. I will fabricate the evidence if I have to. I will drag her memory through the absolute mud and you will be a laughingstock. The pure, vile cruelty of her threat hung heavily in the quiet air between us. She honestly believed that threatening to desecrate my dead mother's memory would finally break me. She thought I would panic and hand over a multi-million-dollar estate just to protect my mother's honor from her vicious, fabricated lies. I sat completely still, letting her bask in her temporary delusion of power. I did not yell, I did not cry, and I certainly did not flinch. Instead, I slowly reached into my designer leather handbag, resting on the seat beside me. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and slid it smoothly across the white tablecloth, stopping right in front of Valerie's, shaking hands. She stared at the envelope, her arrogant smile faltering slightly as confusion clouded her desperate eyes. "Open it," I commanded, my voice dropping to a freezing, icy tone. Valerie hesitated for a brief second before ripping the top of the envelope open. She pulled out a massive stack of high-definition photographs, detailed hotel receipts, and old handwritten letters. The color instantly and completely drained from her face as she stared at the undeniable concrete proof of her own disgusting past. The photographs were clear and damning, showing a much younger Valerie sneaking into cheap roadside motels, with Calvin the dates stamped on the photographs, and the receipts were from 30 years ago, back when my biological mother was still alive and very much married to my father. These were not fabricated rumors, these were hard verified facts, pulled directly from the private investigative files my legal team had legally obtained during the massive federal wire fraud discovery process. My lawyers had completely gutted Calvin's hidden personal safes, looking for hidden assets. And instead, they found the ultimate toxic family secret. They found decades of buried betrayal. Valerie was staring at her own handwritten love letters, begging a married man to abandon his sick wife. She was reading the exact pathetic notes she had sent to Calvin, completely exposing herself as the original homewrecker, the woman who actually tore our family apart. One letter specifically detailed her twisted plan to slowly push my mother out of the picture so Valerie could take her rightful place in high society. She began to hyperventilate, her hands trembling so violently that the photographs fluttered down onto the dining table. She tried to speak, but the words completely died in her throat. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and looked directly into her terrified, panicked eyes. "Release your fake story," I whispered, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across my face. "I will release the real one. Let us see how your church friends react to this. Let us see how the conservative country club ladies treat the woman who actively destroyed a dying woman's marriage and manipulated her way into a stolen life." Valerie sat completely paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing in absolute silent horror. She knew that if these authentic historical documents ever saw the light of day, she would be permanently exiled from every single high society circle in the entire state of Georgia. She would not just be poor, she would be universally despised and completely ostracized. She slowly slid out of the leather booth, clutching the manila envelope to her chest, like a shield. She backed away from my table, completely defeated, broken and terrified, before turning and running out of the restaurant into the dark, humid city night, leaving me to finish my dinner in absolute perfect peace. Thanksgiving morning dawned crisp and cold across the wealthy Buckhead suburbs, but the atmosphere outside the massive, sprawling estate was incredibly tense. The 48-hour federal eviction notice I had legally served, my former family, had officially expired at exactly 8 in the morning. I sat in the back of my sleek black town car, sipping a warm coffee and watching the completely absurd spectacle unfolding through the tinted windows. Calvin, Valerie, and Jasmine had completely lost their minds. They had spent the entire night dragging heavy antique mahogany furniture across the expensive hardwood floors to physically barricade the massive wrought iron front doors. They chained the front security gates shut with cheap, heavy padlocks. They honestly believed that throwing a pathetic physical tantrum would somehow stop a legally binding federal foreclosure. They were trapped inside the cold, dark mansion with no electricity and no running water. Because my legal team had officially terminated all the utility accounts the moment the property title transferred into my name, Calvin suddenly appeared on the second-floor master balcony, looking like a completely broken and deranged man. He was wearing his expensive silk bathrobe, but his face was unshaven, and his eyes were completely wild with exhaustion and pure, unchecked rage. He gripped the cold stone railing with his shaking hands and stared down at my black town car parked perfectly at the end of his long circular driveway. He started screaming at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice echoing through the quiet, wealthy neighborhood. Disturbing the peaceful holiday morning of his elite neighbors, he yelled that I was an ungrateful monster who was destroying my own flesh and blood. "I built this family." Calvin screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of dark purple. "You owe me respect. You owe me everything. You are nothing without my name." I listened to his pathetic delusions of grandeur echoing off the cold stone walls. He honestly still believed he held some kind of supreme patriarchal power over me. He thought I would eventually crack under the heavy emotional weight of family loyalty and simply hand his stolen empire back to him. He expected me to call the local police and have them forcefully dragged out of the house screaming and crying so they could play the ultimate desperate victims for the neighborhood gossip circle. But I was absolutely not going to give them the satisfaction of a private, quiet removal. I picked up my phone and sent a single text message to Elias, my head of security. Less than 2 minutes later, the quiet suburban street was completely flooded with heavy diesel engines. 5 massive white moving trucks turned the corner and slowly backed their way up the long driveway, completely blocking the main road. Right behind them were 3 brightly marked local news vans with their satellite dishes already fully extended. Calvin and Valerie stared down from the balcony in absolute stunned silence as the heavy news truck doors slid open and professional camera crews began setting up their heavy equipment right on the manicured front lawn. Jasmine peered out through the cracks of the barricaded front windows, her face completely pale with pure terror as she realized the local media was about to broadcast their humiliating eviction live on television. I slowly stepped out of my town car wearing a perfectly tailored dark winter coat and walked confidently up the stone driveway. The bright camera lights instantly swiveled to focus completely on me, ignoring the pathetic screaming man on the balcony. The lead reporter from the morning news broadcast rushed up, holding a microphone, and asked me for an official statement regarding the sudden acquisition of the infamous logistics empire and the sprawling family estate. I did not even bother looking up at Calvin or Valerie. I looked directly into the camera lens with a calm, polite smile. I told the reporter that today was a day of profound gratitude and giving back to the community. I explained that my private equity firm had successfully acquired the distressed property after the previous owners completely defaulted due to massive federal wire fraud investigations. Calvin started screaming again, demanding the cameras turn off, but his voice was completely drowned out by the whirring of the news equipment and the steady, confident sound of my own voice. I told the live television audience that I had zero intention of living in a house built on such toxic foundation of greed and deception. Instead, I was using my own personal wealth to completely renovate the entire massive property. I announced that I was officially signing the deed over to a highly respected local charity organization. The sprawling multi-million-dollar Buckhead estate was going to be completely transformed into a premier, fully funded residential academy and safe shelter for at-risk African-American teenage girls from the inner city. The profound, absolute poetic justice of the moment was incredibly satisfying. Calvin and Valerie had spent their entire pathetic lives looking down on minority communities. They had constantly made disgusting elitist comments about people of color and poor inner-city families. They had always prided themselves on keeping their exclusive wealthy neighborhood completely isolated from anyone they deemed socially beneath them. Now their precious, untouchable sanctuary, their massive symbol of generational wealth and white corporate supremacy, was going to be filled with the exact, beautiful, bright young black women they had spent decades actively despising. The mansion would become a beacon of hope and education for the very people Calvin and Valerie had tried so hard to step on. I could hear the absolute final sound of Valerie's soul shattering from the balcony above me. She let out a loud, dramatic wail of pure, agonizing defeat. She realized that not only was she permanently losing her precious mansion, but every single one of her racist, elitist country club friends would be forced to watch a stream of inner-city girls moving into her former luxury bedroom. She was going to be the absolute ultimate laughingstock of her former highly conservative social circle. Jasmine finally broke through the front doors, abandoning the heavy furniture barricade. She ran out onto the stone porch, sobbing uncontrollably and begging the camera crews to listen to her. But the reporters completely ignored her pathetic performance. They were entirely focused on my massive charitable donation and the inspiring story of a successful young woman giving back to the vulnerable youth of Atlanta. I turned to Elias and gave him a brief nod. He signaled the moving crews, who instantly pulled out heavy bolt cutters and snapped the cheap padlocks off the front gates. They marched up the driveway with heavy dollies and empty boxes, ready to pack up whatever cheap personal belongings the former owners had left. I walked calmly back to my waiting town car, knowing that the absolute final nail had been firmly driven into the coffin of the Calvin legacy. I had taken every single piece of their stolen empire and transformed their disgusting greed into something genuinely beautiful. The Thanksgiving sun rose higher in the sky, warming the cold air as I drove away, leaving my completely destroyed former family to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of their new, impoverished lives, completely alone on live local television. I drove away from the newly donated mansion feeling a profound sense of closure, but my elite legal team was already dealing with one final desperate parasite. Connor had somehow managed to liquidate a hidden offshore cryptocurrency wallet just in time to secure a highly questionable bail bondsman to post his federal bond. He was completely confined to a cheap-smelling rental apartment on the bad side of town, wearing a heavy, thick federal tracking monitor strapped tightly to his ankle, but his massive, arrogant ego simply refused to accept total defeat. He honestly believed he was still the smartest man in any room he walked into. He hired a bottom-feeding civil rights attorney who was desperate for media attention and officially filed a massive frivolous lawsuit against my private equity firm. Connor actually had the absolute unmitigated audacity to accuse me of targeted racial discrimination. He sat in his lawyer's cramped, dingy office, pacing back and forth across the stained carpet while slamming his fist on the cheap laminate desk. He was completely red in the face as he spun a disgusting false narrative to paint himself as the ultimate innocent victim. "She hates me because I am a successful white man in her territory." Connor whined loudly to his lawyer, his voice dripping with entitled outrage and completely fake sorrow. "It is reverse racism, and she completely destroyed my legitimate business just because she is a bitter, jealous woman who cannot stand seeing my superior intellect succeed in Atlanta." He honestly thought he could sell this incredibly toxic story to right-wing media outlets and extort a massive multi-million-dollar settlement out of me to pay for his mounting federal criminal defense fees. He planned to ruin my corporate reputation by painting me as an angry, vindictive billionaire who hunted down innocent businessmen for sport. But Connor severely underestimated my head of security, Elias, who had spent the last 3 months working directly alongside my elite corporate lawyers conducting a massive forensic deep dive into Connor's entire pathetic employment history. We did not even wait for a federal judge to review his ridiculous civil lawsuit. Elias marched directly into the mandatory preliminary mediation hearing at the downtown courthouse, carrying 3 massive heavy cardboard boxes packed to the absolute brim with undeniable hard evidence. Connor was sitting across the polished mahogany table wearing a cheap suit and a smug, arrogant grin, fully expecting me to back down and write him a massive settlement check just to make the bad press go away. Elias did not say a single word. At first, he just slammed the heavy boxes down onto the polished table right in front of Connor's smug face, causing the cheap lawyer to flinch backward in his seat. My legal team did not even need to speak, because Elias had personally tracked down the brilliant young founders of three completely separate, highly successful Black-owned tech startups right here in the city of Atlanta. Connor had systematically targeted every single one of them over the last 5 years, using the exact same fraudulent investment playbook he tried to use on my logistics drivers. Elias pulled out stack after stack of forged bank statements, fake patent transfers, and sworn legal affidavits from the three ruined minority business owners. The documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Connor was a serial corporate predator who specifically preyed on successful minority entrepreneurs to maliciously drain their assets and fund his lavish fake lifestyle. Connor's cheap lawyer stared at the mountain of undeniable hard evidence, and his face turned a sickly pale green. He instantly realized that his arrogant client had completely lied to him, and that pursuing this ridiculous reverse racism lawsuit would immediately result in him losing his own law license. The lawyer immediately packed up his leather briefcase and walked right out of the mediation room without saying a single word, leaving his incredibly panicked client completely alone and sweating profusely under the bright fluorescent courthouse lights. But the absolute ultimate crushing blow came later that very same afternoon, while Connor was fleeing back to his miserable, cheap apartment. Connor's incredibly wealthy high society parents up in Boston had finally seen the massive viral news coverage of their disgraced son being arrested and subsequently humiliated by my legal team. They had secretly cut him off financially years ago because of his endless toxic lies and his relentless gambling debts, but now they were forced to publicly address his horrific crimes on a national stage. His incredibly powerful father released a formal public statement to every major national news network, completely and entirely distancing their respected family name from his pathetic existence. They publicly disowned Connor, expressing their deepest, most profound apologies directly to me and the other minority business owners he had ruthlessly scammed. Connor sat completely alone in the dark, staring at his flickering television screen, as his own powerful father called him an absolute disgrace to their family legacy, completely destroying his last microscopic shred of public credibility forever. The morning sun hung exceptionally low over the sprawling Buckhead estate, casting long, harsh, bitter shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. The spectacular media circus from Thanksgiving morning had slowly dwindled down, but a few highly dedicated local news crews were still hungrily waiting outside the iron gates for the absolute final shot of the disgraced family leaving their stolen fortress. A rusty, dented, rented moving truck sat incredibly awkwardly on the pristine circular stone driveway, leaking dark, heavy oil onto the expensive imported pavers. It was officially moving day, and the absolute crushing reality of their new, impoverished existence had finally and violently set in. Calvin and Valerie were physically dragging heavy, black trash bags filled with whatever cheap designer knockoffs and irrelevant junk they were legally allowed to keep. They could not afford to hire a professional moving company because my lawyers had successfully frozen absolutely every single financial account they possessed. They looked completely exhausted and entirely defeated. Their faces were pale, and their movements were incredibly sluggish as they hauled their pathetic belongings into the back of the dirty rented truck under the bright, blinding glare of the local news cameras. Jasmine marched out of the grand mahogany front doors, carrying a stack of overflowing cardboard boxes, and her face was completely twisted into a mask of pure, venomous rage. The immense heavy stress of losing her massive fake fortune and watching her fraudulent husband get dragged away in federal handcuffs had completely shattered the delicate fake bond she shared with her mother. She threw the heavy cardboard boxes violently onto the wet stone driveway, causing cheap plastic shoes and broken beauty products to spill out everywhere across the pristine ground. Valerie immediately shrieked at her, demanding that she show some respect and help them pack the truck properly so they could escape the humiliating gaze of the reporters. But Jasmine absolutely snapped. She completely lost whatever tiny fragment of sanity she had left. She marched directly up to Valerie and got right into her mother's face, completely ignoring the flashing camera lenses of the eager news reporters standing just a few feet away behind the security perimeter. "This is entirely your fault," Jasmine screamed hysterically, her shrill voice echoing loudly across the wealthy suburban neighborhood. "You told me Connor was incredibly rich and you forced me to marry him just so we could maintain our pathetic fake social status in this stupid city. You told me Maya was a complete loser and that we would easily take all of her money and live like absolute royalty." Jasmine was completely unhinged, crying and pointing aggressively at her mother's chest, blaming her for every single miserable failure in her rapidly collapsing life. She screamed about losing her country club memberships, her expensive spa days, and her entire fake identity because of Valerie's toxic manipulative scheming. Valerie turned a dangerous shade of bright crimson as the reporters rapidly snapped photos of the spectacular public meltdown. She raised her trembling hand and slapped Jasmine violently across the face with a loud, sharp crack that instantly silenced the entire driveway. The perfect unified family had completely turned on each other, tearing into their own flesh and blood like starved, desperate wolves, fighting over the absolute last pathetic scraps of a rotting carcass. Jasmine collapsed onto the hard stone driveway, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, while Valerie turned away completely disgusted by her own screaming daughter. I stood in perfect absolute silence, leaning casually against the polished black door of my heavily armored Maybach, watching their entire pathetic world completely self-destruct. My security chief Elias stood a few feet away, keeping a watchful eye on the aggressive news crews, but my complete attention was focused solely on the spectacular implosion of the people who used to make my childhood a living nightmare. I did not smile and I did not laugh or gloat. I just watched them with cold, calculating clinical precision. I analyzed their frantic, desperate movements the exact same way a brilliant scientist studies a predictable chemical reaction in a highly controlled laboratory environment. They had spent their entire lives building an incredibly fragile house of cards, based entirely on deceit, manipulation, and disgusting greed. I did not have to push them over the edge to destroy them. I simply removed the stolen financial foundation that held them up and watched gravity do the absolute rest. The sheer poetic justice of watching them pack their own trash bags was more satisfying than any amount of money could ever be. Calvin slowly walked down the stone steps of the grand mansion, leaving his sobbing daughter and his furious wife fighting behind him. He looked like an absolute hollow, empty shell of the terrifying, commanding patriarch I vividly remembered from my dark youth. His expensive tailored suit hung loosely on his shrinking, frail frame, and his shoulders were completely stooped with the heavy, permanent weight of his absolute total failure. He shuffled slowly across the wet driveway, dragging his feet heavily, until he stood just a few feet away from my pristine luxury vehicle. The flashing cameras captured every single micro-expression on his deeply lined face as he stared at me with pure, broken defeat. He looked at my expensive clothes, my elite security team, and the massive, sprawling estate that now legally belonged to my charitable foundation. He swallowed hard, his eyes completely dead and empty, as he finally realized that the daughter he threw away was the undisputed master of his entire universe. "Are you completely happy now?" Calvin asked, his voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate weakness that made him sound like a small, terrified child instead of a ruthless corporate titan. He gestured weakly toward the rusty moving truck and his violently imploding family. "Is the grand revenge finally sweet enough for you? Maya, have you completely satisfied your sick desire to watch us suffer and lose everything we built?" He actually believed that he was still the victim in this scenario. I did not blink and I did not show him a single microscopic ounce of human sympathy. I slowly stood up straight and looked directly into the hollow, empty eyes of the man who used to call me a worthless mistake. "This is absolutely not revenge, Dad," I replied, my voice completely smooth and devoid of any emotion at all. "This is simply a corporate audit, and you just could not afford the massive negative balance. I turned my back on him completely and stepped into the quiet, luxurious interior of my waiting Maybach, leaving him standing completely alone on the cold, wet driveway to pack his trash bags into the back of a cheap rented truck. 6 months passed since that cold Thanksgiving morning, and the crisp autumn air had fully surrendered to the thick, bright warmth of a classic Atlanta spring, the kind of beautiful, bright day that felt like an absolute rebirth. I stood in the massive grand lobby of my brand new commercial tech hub, located right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The sprawling state-of-the-art facility was a soaring masterpiece of modern glass and sleek polished steel, reflecting the bright city sun like a massive, brilliant diamond. The soaring ceilings and the pristine white marble floors echoed with the excited chatter of hundreds of elite guests, politicians and local business leaders who had all gathered for the highly anticipated official ribbon-cutting ceremony. My private equity firm had spent the last half-year completely transforming an abandoned industrial complex into the premier innovation center for minority entrepreneurs in the entire Southeast region. We were providing massive grants, fully funded incubator spaces, and top-tier legal resources to brilliant young minds who had been systematically ignored by the traditional wealthy gatekeepers of the city. I wore a stunning, perfectly tailored, pristine white designer suit that made me look like an absolute titan of industry. I stood on the raised glass podium looking out over the massive crowd of wealthy investors and powerful city officials who were now practically begging for 5 minutes of my time. Elias stood faithfully near the edge of the stage, his arms crossed, wearing his usual sharp dark suit and a look of quiet, profound pride. The mayor of Atlanta stepped up to the crystal microphone to deliver the keynote address, his voice booming through the massive state-of-the-art sound system, echoing across the grand lobby. He looked directly at me, with genuine, deep admiration, as the cameras flashed all around us. He told the massive crowd that I was an absolute visionary who turned her personal pain into a multi-million-dollar empire that uplifts our entire community. He praised my relentless dedication to the city, pointing out how the former Buckhead estate was already successfully housing and educating 50 brilliant young Black girls who were now thriving in an environment of total luxury and absolute safety. The crowd erupted into deafening applause, their cheers bouncing off the massive glass walls. I smiled and nodded gracefully, accepting the massive wave of public adoration, but my mind was incredibly calm and perfectly quiet. I stepped down from the podium as the catering staff began circulating through the wealthy crowd with expensive silver trays of vintage champagne and delicate imported appetizers. I slowly walked away from the flashing cameras and the desperate networking executives, making my way toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that completely dominated the front wall of the luxury tech hub. The thick, reinforced glass offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the bustling, busy downtown streets below. I stood there silently holding a delicate crystal flute of expensive champagne, just watching the chaotic rhythm of the city, moving right outside my quiet, pristine sanctuary across the busy intersection, directly opposite my towering multi-million-dollar empire, was a rundown discount grocery store with flickering neon signs and a cracked concrete parking lot. I watched as the automatic sliding doors jerked open and two incredibly familiar figures stumbled out onto the hot, sticky pavement. Valerie and Jasmine were physically fighting over a cheap, ripped plastic grocery bag. Their once flawless blonde hair was completely unkempt and frizzy, sticking to their sweating faces in the humid afternoon heat. Valerie was wearing a faded, outdated dress that had clearly been washed far too many times, and she looked absolutely exhausted and deeply bitter. Jasmine was screaming at her mother, stamping her feet on the dirty concrete and aggressively pointing at a crumpled store receipt in her hand. They looked like two desperate, miserable strangers fighting over pennies. The elegant high society facade they had murdered my mother to achieve was completely gone, replaced by the harsh, brutal reality of absolute crushing poverty. They were entirely trapped in their own miserable, toxic company with absolutely no one left to manipulate and no one left to steal from. "This is entirely your fault!" Jasmine screamed hysterically, her shrill voice echoing faintly through the thick glass window. "You told me Connor was incredibly rich, and you told me Maya was a complete loser. You ruined my life." Jasmine was completely unhinged, crying and pointing aggressively at her mother's chest, blaming her for every single miserable failure. Valerie turned a dangerous shade of bright crimson. She raised her trembling hand and slapped Jasmine violently across the face. The perfect unified family had completely turned on each other, tearing into their own flesh and blood, like starved, desperate wolves, fighting over the absolute last pathetic scraps of a rotting carcass. Just as Valerie angrily snatched the plastic bag away from her screaming daughter, a large, loud diesel delivery truck aggressively pulled into the discount grocery store parking lot, grinding its heavy gears and spewing a thick cloud of dark gray exhaust into the hot air. The truck belonged to a second-rate regional logistics company, the exact same rival company that Calvin had spent the last 2 decades trying to ruthlessly run out of business. The heavy side door of the truck loudly popped open, and Calvin stepped down onto the hot pavement, wearing a cheap, sweaty brown uniform, with his name stitched poorly over the front pocket. He looked incredibly old and completely broken, his face heavily lined with pure daily misery, as he slowly began unloading heavy cardboard boxes of cheap discounted produce for minimum wage. His massive inflated ego had been completely shattered, leaving behind an empty, exhausted man who had to physically labor in the intense, humid heat just to afford a miserable, cheap apartment. I watched him struggle with the heavy boxes, remembering the day he walked up to my Maybach outside the foreclosed mansion, looking completely broken. He had asked me if I was happy now, and if the revenge was sweet enough. I had looked him dead in the eye and told him this was not revenge, but simply an audit, and he just could not afford the balance. Watching him now sweating in a cheap uniform, I knew I had been absolutely right. I took a slow, quiet sip of my expensive vintage champagne, feeling the cool, crisp liquid slide down my throat. I knew exactly where Connor was at that exact same moment. He was currently sitting in a tiny concrete cell in a maximum security federal prison, completely stripped of his expensive tailored suits and his massive, arrogant entitlement. His wealthy, powerful family had completely abandoned him, leaving him to rot entirely alone with nothing but his own pathetic lies for company. He would not see the outside of a prison wall for at least another 15 years, and even then he would emerge as a completely ruined, convicted felon with absolutely zero future. I stood behind the thick, pristine glass, completely untouched by the noise and the miserable heat, and the pathetic struggles of the people who had tried so desperately to break me. I searched my heart, looking for that familiar burning fire of pure, blinding rage that had fueled my massive, rapid ascent to power for so many years. But I found absolutely nothing. The deep, toxic anger was completely gone, leaving behind a profound, absolute sense of perfect peace. I realized in that beautiful, quiet moment that this was never really about revenge. Taking away their stolen money and watching them suffer was just a minor, temporary satisfaction. The absolute ultimate true payoff was not destroying them. It was showing them that I had become a brilliant, untouchable titan in the exact same world they had constantly told me I was far too weak and far too unfit to ever enter. I had not just survived their incredible cruelty, I had completely conquered their entire universe and reshaped it entirely in my own image. I slowly turned my back on the massive window, leaving Calvin, Valerie, and Jasmine to their miserable, pathetic lives in the hot, humid street below. I walked back toward the center of the grand lobby where my elite team of brilliant executives and loyal friends were waiting for me. They raised their crystal glasses as I approached, their faces glowing with absolute genuine respect and shared triumph. I raised my own glass of champagne to meet theirs, flashing a brilliant, confident smile that radiated pure, absolute victory. The perfect, beautiful sound of ringing crystal echoed softly through the massive, gleaming tech hub as the scene slowly, gracefully faded to black. The greatest lesson from this story is that true power does not come from seeking revenge against the people who hurt you. It comes from building a life so incredibly successful that their toxic opinions simply no longer matter. Maya proved that when manipulative family members try to tear you down and tell you that you are entirely worthless, you must never let their cruelty dictate your future. Instead, use it as fuel to create your own massive success. Your worth is defined strictly by your own resilience, not by their desperate lies. If you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below and hit that subscribe button for more satisfying stories.